All right, so welcome to Philosophers in the Midst of History. We've got a little bit of a change from the schedule that we normally had. This is actually year 10 of the series. The Frank Weinberg Library has been hosting it this entire time. And we were originally scheduled to do Diogenes of Sinope for our spring thing, or not spring, but at end of winter in February, but you remember we had that huge snowstorm, so they canceled it. And I talked to the adult services librarian, Ashley, and she said, well, what do you want to do? And I said, well, I really want to do the Diogenes, so let's do that in May. And that means pushing some other things. So we are going to do, usually we do an ancient, a medieval, a early modern, and a late modern. So we're skipping the medieval this time. So if you were here for Meister Eckhart, you might be disappointed. But Diogenes is kind of a weird guy, so there's a lot of cool stuff about him.
Mostly like all weird. I mean, depends on who you understand.
Well, weird. Diogenes is weird. He makes the other philosophers look normal. I'll put it to you that way. So yeah, I mean, most of them are odd in some sense or another, but he kind of takes it to a whole other level. But then in the fall, we're going to do Mary Wollstonecraft, and then we're finishing up the year by looking at Karl Popper in November. And we've discussed a lot of ancient thinkers over the years from a variety of philosophical schools, some of whom started schools themselves. And this time we're looking at the most famous member of the Cynic school, the ancient Cynics, who are a bit different than what we call Cynics today. They don't mean just people who are, like the Charles Bukowskis of their time, grumpy, or, Louis Ferdinand Céline, or people like that. There was an actual philosophy involved in it. And some people think that Diogenes might have actually been the founder of the Cynic school. So we'll talk about that a little bit as well. And we're also doing something that's a little bit different this time, in that every session before this, we've looked at somebody whose books you could get. Maybe not a lot of books, like Epictetus only has the two, the Enchiridion and the Discourses. Plato has a ton of books, right? You can easily, there's like a whole section in the library for that. Diogenes wrote books, but we don't have any of his books. So, you might say, well, where are we getting all these ideas about him from? From what other people have had to say. So everything is kind of secondhand, you might say. And that raises some problems. We do have a lot of what they call testimonials about him, meaning that philosophers wrote down things that he said or did in these particular situations. But they're all from later authors. There's no contemporary who is reporting on him. And among the philosophers that wrote about him, there's a guy named Diogenes Laertes. He's very important. He is a historian of philosophy, not very original, which is exactly what you want in a historian. Scholars think he was smart, but he wasn't like super high level smart. So they think that the stuff that he wrote is actually probably accurate, because he wasn't smart enough to make stuff up, We've also got Cicero, who we did a whole session on, and he has a lot to say about Diogenes, none of it good. He thinks that he's a bad guy. Philo of Alexandria writes about him. Seneca, the Stoic, writes about him. Plutarch writes about him. He's kind of iffy about Diogenes. Epictetus thinks that Diogenes is wonderful, so we'll talk about that in a bit. The physician Galen, who is also a philosopher, he wrote about Diogenes. Dio Chrysostom, who was a Stoic, writes about him. Lucian of Samosata, who's officially a satirist, but he knows a lot of philosophy. He tells us some things. And then we've got Julian the Emperor, also known as Julian the Apostate, because he's the guy, after Christianity was endorsed by Constantine, he was like, nah, let's shift things back to Greek paganism. And that didn't last long. during his lifetime. But he was a philosopher, and so he wrote about Diogenes. And we also have, as I was just saying before, we have some things that are attributed to Diogenes called the Cynic epistles. So epistle means letter. Nobody thinks these are actually by the people they're attributed to. Some of them are attributed to Diogenes, some to his student Crates, some are attributed to Socrates, others, an even earlier guy, Anacharsis, who was a Scythian, and no scholar believes that these are actually by these people because they were probably written in the 1st century BCE, so way after these guys are around. And we also see Diogenes coming up in artwork. There's bas-reliefs of him, mosaics, and statues, all sorts of interesting stuff depicting this guy. Which of it is accurate? Again, we don't know. I think he probably would have actually been a little pleased with that. Now, I gave you a timeline, and you notice, unlike other places, we don't know what year he was born. He may have been born in 404. He might have been born some other time. A lot of the other important years, we don't actually know. We're just we're saying like, well, they have to have happened before this or after this, but we don't have accurate records for a lot of what this guy did. And we do have, what was happening with other philosophers or what's happening in Athens and Greece as a whole. What we can say is this. He was born in Sinope, which is a city on the Black Sea in Asia Minor, which had been settled by Greeks a long time before that. He had a father whose name was Hicasius, and his father was a banker. What exactly he was doing as a banker, we're not entirely sure. And he was in charge of the coinage. And this will actually be a little bit important. It's unclear because there's multiple stories about what happened, but there was some sort of scandal that involved Diogenes and his dad, and it had to do with debasing the currency. So debasing the currency means taking the coins and, recasting them, but not with the same metal, or shaving off bits of it, or hollowing them out and putting other stuff inside. And it may have had some political reasons for doing that. We're not really sure. We do read in Diogenes Laertes that Diogenes relates that he went into exile because his father was entrusted with the money of the state and adulterated the coinage. But somebody else in his book on Diogenes says that Diogenes himself did this and was forced to leave home along with his father. So he would have gotten his dad in trouble. Moreover, Diogenes himself actually confesses in his Portulus, a lost writing, that he adulterated the coinage. So we don't really know one way or the other. And you notice there's references to books we don't have in this. Diogenes Laertes had these, but we don't have access to any of these. He does come to Athens. We know that happened. And he had a slave who very quickly ran away from him. And then according to the traditional accounts, after spending a good bit of time and effort with this guy Antisthenes, who we'll talk about in just a bit, Antisthenes would hit him with his staff. He's like, I want to be your student. And Antisthenes would hit him and say, get the hell out of here. I don't want a student. Diogenes wins him over, and he becomes a student. And that's, Antisthenes is the beginner officially of the Cynic school. So Diogenes would be his one and only student. And that's the lineage that then begins. We don't know if this did happen or not. He remains in Athens, and he, depending on how you look at this sort of behavior, he's either like a complete jerk who deliberately ticks people off and goes out of his way to do so, including Plato, who he really had a lot of bad encounters with, or he's pursuing the life of virtue in a Socratic way and sort of taking it up to another level, intensifying it. And he does this, how long? We don't know, again. You notice this is becoming a common theme. He does go on a voyage. He traveled actually quite a few places. He goes on a voyage to Aegina, and as sometimes happened, his ship gets captured by pirates, and they take him to Crete. Crete was a place where you would sell slaves, and a guy from Corinth, which is another one of those Greek city-states, purchases him, takes him home to be a tutor for his kids, and he stays in Corinth more or less the rest of his life. So he starts out, in Sinope, goes to Athens, winds up in Corinth, and that's where some of the famous encounters. If he did encounter Alexander the Great, it would have been in Corinth rather than in Athens. And he's supposed to have met the king of Macedon. He's also supposed to have taught people there and done a lot of weird things, like living inside of a wine barrel, sort of like, a very, very small caravan, I suppose. People live out of their cars. He was doing something kind of similar. And he's purchased by this guy, this Corinthian. So he's up there on the slave market. And, they would do things like say, what do you do? What's your specialty? And Diogenes says, well, I'm in charge of ruling people. So whoever needs a master, I'm a good person for them to purchase. So this rich guy, Xeniades, purchases him and not only entrusts his kids to him, but his whole household. So Diogenes, was in a pretty good way. How long did he stay with him? Again, what's the answer? We don't know. Well, you don't have the numbers, yeah.
So is there sort of a parallel between the Diogenes story and the Joseph story? Sold into slavery, becomes the master of the household, attempted to be seduced by Potiphar's wife, but doesn't succeed.
There's no seduction thing in there, but otherwise you could say, I would say this, you can draw a parallel, but there isn't a parallel. It's just one that we would say, yeah, it looks kind of like this.
Are these stories common in the ancient Eastern Mediterranean?
No, there's no the Joseph story came first and then Diogenes imitated it or people attributed it to him. They just happen to have done somewhat similar things, but also very dissimilar things. Joseph has a whole family. Diogenes doesn't. Joseph goes back and saves his family from a famine and all that. Diogenes hangs out in Corinth for years and years and years. So, yeah. So anyway, we know that he did travel a little bit. He goes to Megara, which is another city-state. He went to Olympus, kind of a popular destination. He appears to have gone to Delphi, so maybe he consulted the oracle, but we don't know about that. Some sources say that he debased the coinage after being given some sort of prompting from the oracle, but the rest of them don't. So we don't really know. And he's supposed to have written a number of works. And in ancient philosophy, we probably have at best 20% of what was written, in ancient times. We don't even have everything Plato wrote or everything Aristotle wrote. There are entire schools where we have lists of what the books were, and we don't have any of them. And so with the Cynics, that's the case. So he's supposed to have written a bunch of books. Here's the titles of them. We don't know what was in them. So he wrote some dialogues called Kephalion, Ichthyus, the Jackdaw, Portulus, the Athenian Demos. He wrote a Republic, and a Republic would be something that's obviously a political treatise, right? What it contained, we don't know. He wrote an Art of Ethics. Okay, that's definitely about ethics. On wealth, so maybe economics, on love, and then on death, and some letters, and then he wrote some other dialogues. And he wrote tragedies, 7 of them. Again, we don't have any of them. We don't have the plots of them, but he wrote about Helen, Thyestes, Heracles, Achilles, Medea, Chrysippus, and Oedipus. And he would have been writing in the time that we call New Tragedy. So this is after, like, Aeschylus and Sophocles and Euripides. This would be a later time. Maybe they were good, maybe they weren't. We don't really know. So I'll give you a little sketch of what it would have been like for him to live there at that time. And then before we do like the representative crazy stories about them, we'll do some Q&A. So Athens was, one of the most important cities of Greece. It wasn't the only place that philosophy was going on. Obviously, he went to Corinth and taught philosophy there, and there were other people doing that. The major Greek city-states, the most important ones were Athens, Sparta, Thebes. You had Persia, the Persian Empire to the east, Egypt to the south. And the Persians would get involved in Greek affairs, try to stir stuff up, cause trouble. But Greeks would also go over to Persia and, work as mercenaries or things like that. And there was this Macedonian kingdom to the north. And that's where Alexander the Great is going to come from after his father, Philip, conquers most of mainland Greece. And all of this is happening after and in the middle of a couple centuries of pretty important cultural development, which included the rise of philosophy. We've got Socrates on the scene, and then you've got all of his students, which include Diogenes' teacher, Antisthenes. Rhetoric has become very important as well. Drama, medicine, literacy is kind of spreading. So, he could get bought by a guy who's like, yeah, I want my kids to be brought up right. This guy's, literate. He knows some things. He can teach my kids. 200 years ago, that might not have happened, right? So this is a growing culture. Philosophy at that time was not just viewed as like a theoretical activity that you would do all by yourself in your room, reading books or stuff like that. It was viewed as a way of living, a way of understanding the universe and yourself that would lead to ultimately happiness by making the right sort of choices. There were a lot of different options in philosophy by the time that Diogenes was showing up. They were slave societies, as were most ancient societies, once they got past a certain level of development. So, Diogenes can be a slave and then be freed. And they also had a lot of, people who were slaves because they went into debt or were taken as war captives. But it wasn't like antebellum slavery where it was race-based. Anybody could become a slave, basically. And anybody could be freed from being a slave if they had the right kind of master. And so the philosophical schools of the time, most of them are descended from this guy Socrates. So Socrates, we usually think of like Socrates teaches Plato, teaches Aristotle, right? That's what we get in our World Civ textbooks or history textbooks. That did happen, and Plato's Academy is a really important school. But Socrates had all these other students. So some of them go to other places. The Megarian school is named after Megara. One of his students, Euclid, goes there. Phaedo, young friend of Socrates, goes to Elis and starts a school there. Aristippus, he's a slightly older student. He goes to Cyrene, founds a school there. So you've got all these different schools. And then we have this guy Antisthenes. So Antisthenes was a friend of Socrates, looks like he was one of his students. And he was, you could say that different people emphasize different parts of Socrates' message, right? Some are more about the unexamined life is not worth living, I know that I don't know things, the epistemological stuff. Some are much more about you should live a life of simplicity and virtue and freeing yourself from attachment to things that don't really matter and focus on the things that do matter. And that would be Antisthenes. And he was pretty hardcore with this. There's actually a story where Socrates sees his threadbare clothing and says, your pride is showing through your clothes. I can see it through the holes in there. Because, he was a tough guy, you could say. And there's the stories that could be told about Antisthenes. They're pretty interesting. He lived in a little room by himself. He wasn't an ascetic like not drinking wine, but he would drink the cheap stuff. And so then he gets invited to good parties where they're drinking the expensive stuff. And they're like, you probably don't appreciate this. And he's like, no, I appreciate it more than you guys do because I don't have to have it. You drink this stuff all the time. I can enjoy myself drinking the cheap stuff. I can also enjoy myself drinking the expensive stuff. Similarly, when it came to like sexual desire, he's like, I'll go out with the ugly women because, they deserve love too and they don't turn me down, I don't have to spend a lot of time, pursuing them or anything like that. So keep your life simple, keep pleasures sort of, you just do what you need to do, but you don't want to get too attached to them or anything like that. And so there's going to be some other schools added to the mix around the time of Diogenes. There's this guy Pyrrho who goes and hangs out with Alexander's army and then comes back and teaches this skeptical stuff. There's Epicurus coming in later on, Aristotle, of course. Later on, we'll have the Stoics stemming from Diogenes' student, Crates, who teaches Zeno. So you got a lot of stuff going on in this time. So I'll give you some of the key ideas about the Cynics, but before we do that, any questions? I've already thrown a lot of information at you.
When did Socrates live?
Sort of straddling the 5th and 4th century. He's old enough to be in the Peloponnesian War as a soldier. So in relation to Diogenes, we'd be talking about 2 generations effectively difference. Socrates is pretty old when he's executed. He's in his 70s. So, any other questions? By the way, Socrates probably wouldn't have been as influential had he not been executed, and like made a big display of, why he's not going to stop doing philosophy at his trial. I think that probably cemented his reputation. Well, let's talk about the Cynics then. So, they had this almost single-minded focus on living a lifestyle that was, to use their words, following nature. So living a life that has as few extras in it as possible and is simplified. And it's a lot easier to do that, say, in a place like ancient Greece than it is, say, here in Wisconsin, right? I mean, you can live out on the street in ancient Greece because it's nice most of the time. There's a little bit of snow from time to time and some storms, but imagine trying to do that, over in the park there. You're just going to set up a tent and stay there the whole time. That'd be pretty miserable during winter, right? So they did that. They tried to reduce their needs and their wants to a minimum. And they're kind of experimenting with their life. Everybody else is like, oh, I want a lot of stuff. That's the successful life. They're like, no, that's not the way to go. The goal is to be fully happy, to enjoy what they call eudaimonia, which is not just the feeling of happiness, but like having a good life, having something that you can look at and say, this is really how a person ought to live. And how do you do that? Well, by freeing yourself not just of attachments to things, but freeing yourself of false ideas, of false beliefs and foolishness. So they had this word that they used a lot, tufos, which means smoke, literally. But for them, it also means mistaken ideas, foolishness, arrogance, and it stems from false judgments about values. This is kind of a common thing in every society, right? People are mistaken about what's really going to make them happy. They want to get the next promotion because once that happens, everything will fall into place. I won't have this jerk who's a boss telling me what to do. I'll be the boss instead. And then they get it and they're not that happy. Or, man, if I could just like make more money or win the lottery, my life would fall into place. Or if I could just meet the right person and get married to them, everything will be perfect after that. Well, those are false beliefs, right? And people were just as prone to them in ancient times as they still are now. And some of those beliefs could also be like, hey, I deserve this. People aren't recognizing me the way they should. That's false beliefs. That's tufos. The world doesn't ensure that to you. So getting rid of that's important, right? And by doing that, you slowly wean yourself away from a bad character, what they viewed as, vicious desires for things that you shouldn't care about so much. Now, the way that they did it, this is where you might be like, yeah, that sounds really good. I can buy that. So the way that they typically did it was by indulging in, it's usually translated as shamelessness, right? Not being embarrassed about doing things that other people consider to be shameful. And, here's where some of us might part company. So, Diogenes, as we'll talk about later, not only did he eat in the marketplace, which was considered a no-no, he would masturbate in the marketplace and then justify it by saying, I wish that I could satisfy hunger so easily just by rubbing my belly. That's pretty out there. He would walk into rich people's places, look around, and then spit on the floor and say, I didn't see any useful place to spit. It's all too nice here. So now, is he doing this just to be a jerk? No, he's like showing something about these things that you're so concerned about. They're not really natural. They're the result of buying into social conventions. Another thing that they talked about a lot is the Greek word for it is parrhesia. And sometimes it's translated as freedom of speech, right? But it's not exactly like our First Amendment freedom of speech idea. Anybody gets to say what they want. It's also translated as frankness of speech. So when somebody says, I'm going to be frank with you, you're not going to like what they have to say, right? Because they're going to tell you something that you need to hear, but you're not looking forward to hearing. I'll be frank with you. This is not a very good paper. I'll be frank with you. You think you're a lot more attractive than you are. Think whatever you want, right? And that's what he thought was very important. He also thought, they thought, the Cynics, that if you want to be able to do this, you have to engage in what they called ascesis. And we translate this as training or discipline. It's the word that we get ascetic from. So, one of the practices that Diogenes would do was to harden the body. He would go around, he would stay outside in winter and in summer, and he would do things like hug statues. And, why hug a statue? Because the statue is either going to suck heat out of you or it's going to be really hot. You lay in the sun, you take on toils or pains that other people try to avoid. So what are you doing there? You're not doing it just to show what a tough guy you are. You're trying to discipline yourself. I remember, when I was a kid and doing martial arts, working at a restaurant where I was supposed to wash dishes and stuff like that, and deliberately sticking my hands into either very cold water or very hot water and holding them there despite the pain that it caused to show that I could do it to myself. That's the sort of thing he's talking about there. Ultimately, not a smart thing to do. It's not good for you, but it does let you sort of discipline your body. Friedrich Nietzsche, by the way, who's not a cynic, when he was a kid, I think it was like a hot piece of metal. It wasn't that he held a flame to his hand. He was arguing with some of his classmates about whether the Christian martyrs could have endured the things that they did So if I'm remembering it right, he heated up a piece of metal and then he held it in his hand to like show, yeah, somebody can actually do this. You skeptics are full of crap, and it hurt his hand, of course, right? But, you could do less strenuous things like this. They also, and here's another thing we might not necessarily go along with them on, they didn't have jobs, day jobs. They would beg. They'd go around and ask for, some food and stuff like that. So, a lot of people are like, these dirty bums, they come into town, they wear this crappy clothing, they spit on our floors, and now they're asking for food. So, that there could be that. They could also do things like teaching or, sometimes they would work a job, but just for a short period of time, because you don't want to get too attached to material possessions. And you also want to eat, whatever you can to toughen your body up. So they didn't withdraw from society and like go out into the woods and become a hermit. They stayed in the middle of the cities, and they would make an example of themselves as like, this is what a human being could be like. All of you, wimps and squares, you're not up to that sort of thing, but I am providing a model to you. And so some of them would actually call themselves heralds of the gods. They're there spreading a divine message. And they would also engage in not just frank speaking, they would engage in deliberate diatribes. The word diatribe becomes a literary genre in part because of the Cynics going into places and like, getting out a scroll, and now I'm going to tell you about the guy who's in charge. They'll go through his bad qualities. They would criticize practices and ideals and individual people. They originate some of the satires that are found in ancient literature, right? So that's a direction that they go. And to bring it to sort of a close about who these guys were, there's two things. One is, who do you think their favorite Greek hero or god would be? Any guesses?
Hercules?
Exactly, yeah. And Hercules is kind of a double threat. He is a hero who becomes a god. Hercules is this tough guy who doesn't take anything really for himself. He just goes around and takes on labors, ponos, toils. Now he does some bad stuff along the way here and there, but for the most part, he is a savior. There are like images of Hercules Sotor, which means savior, and so he was this legendary character. The Cynics saw him as like an ideal, and he's also living a simple life. He's got his lion skin, his club, and they had three things that I guess you could call it a costume or a uniform. So they'd have a staff, because you'd be doing a lot of walking. You're outside a lot. And you could use the staff to dogs come after you, hit the dogs, robbers, you take care of them. A wallet, it's often translated as. But I think a better translation would be like a knapsack or a backpack or something like that. You'd keep all your provisions, everything that you own in this wallet. And then a big cloak, almost like, imagine, like we have sleeping bags. So imagine a sleeping bag that you can also use as a garment, right? And you would be outside, you would just roll yourself up in your cloak and sleep that way. And, for them, it was pretty comfortable. So this is what Diogenes himself. Antisthenes still had a room. Diogenes doesn't. Diogenes is kind of taking this Cynic lifestyle further than Antisthenes. He does have a barrel that he lives in for a while. There's actually a funny story about that, which again we don't know whether it's true or not. Some boys break his barrel. And the citizens of Corinth, who think that Diogenes is an interesting character, they don't put him up in a house, they buy him another barrel. So they're like, I guess he likes this, you know. And then there's another funny story too. Corinth is under a siege, and so Diogenes starts rolling his barrel back and forth because everybody's like, you know, doing things like, you know, getting rocks and arrows ready and stuff like that. And they're like, what are you doing? And he's like, oh, well, everybody else is so busy. I thought I better do something so that people don't think I'm like, you know, slacking off. Sort of like, you know, in the office when the boss comes by, suddenly you start tapping on your computer, you know. So he's probably just screwing with them at that point. But there's a lot of great stories about the guy. Again, how true are they? We don't really know. I mean, you could say like with the biblical stories, right? Is the point like to figure out, did this actually happen exactly this way? No, it's about like, what does it convey to us? So here's one of the stories. He would often say that the gods had given to us human beings the means of living easily, but we forgot about it. Why? Because we need luxury. So he talks about honeyed cakes and salves or unguents that smell nice and the like. And somebody comes to him and says, I'm not really well adapted to this life that you're talking about, the life of philosophy. And he says, well, why don't you kill yourself then if you don't want to live well? You know, why live a crappy life? And he said that nothing in life has any chance of succeeding without strenuous practice, and this can overcome anything. So we should be picky about the things that we devote our energies to. He talks about useless toils, and we might think about, you know, some of the jobs that we've had. We're like, oh man, it was a waste of a couple of years on my part. You know, I did everything for these people or this company and got nothing to show for it. Right? That'd be a useless toil, and it seemed reasonable at the time. But you look back on it, and you're like, that didn't help out at all. You know, go ahead.
Well, what would be a useful toil to him? I mean,
Oh.
like going out begging? I mean, I don't know.
Well, begging isn't much of a toil for him because he's cool with that. But the hugging the statues, making your body stronger. I mean, going to the gym, I guess for us could be that. Or you look at Hercules, right? A lot of the things that Hercules did were socially beneficial in one way or another. You know, a monster was. Now he's not saying let's go out and find monsters or anything like that. But you know, there's a lot of things where cultivating a garden could be a useful toil. You know, it's productive. Writing books, teaching people, stuff like that. So he says that human beings are kind of crazy. He talks about madness, and they wind up making themselves miserable. And, you know, how do they do this? By choosing a life basically devoted to pleasures, thinking that's going to make them happy, when what ends up happening a lot of the time is, you know, we get the pleasures we want, and then we're sick of them. We get tired of them. Yeah, go ahead.
Strikes me, based on what you're saying, is he has a super ego and he's a megalomaniac. Everything I'm doing is wonderful, it's great for society, I'm doing all these perfect things.
Yeah.
And you're a bunch of no goodness.
I wouldn't project any of that onto him. Psychoanalytic categories are not useful for looking at people from
I'm not
ancient
saying
times.
he's right, but
Yeah.
he's got this judgment.
Well, everybody has judgments. You can't live a life without judgments, and the goal is not to have crazy ones.
Some of his judgments perhaps may not be as
Yeah.
positive and as viable as he would like them, or he thinks they should be.
Well, he certainly seemed to do okay with it. So, you know, if the measure is whether it's viable, it was viable for him, and it was viable for other people. I'm not an endorser of it. And a lot of other ancient philosophers weren't either. They were like, these guys are just bums, but it is possible to live like a bum. People do it all the time. So viability, you know, that's not a particularly useful measure for this one. But the positive thing, it depends on what you view as positive. If you view freedom, you know, from social conventions as really good, then being a cynic kind of makes sense. Or other things that are similar, like
You have anarchy. If you have freedom from social convention, you lead to anarchy.
Well, it depends on how many of them you get rid of, because you don't get rid of every single convention all at once, and most people aren't cynics. So you're right that if like everybody in the world embraced cynicism, you might have that as a problem. But in point of fact, no, that never happens. As a matter of fact, not even 10% of the people embrace that sort of stuff. They keep on doing their normal stuff. Yeah.
Do you think that, or did people kind of accept that behavior similarly to how they have come to just sort of contemporary-wise, they've come to accept that Zizek may do something kind of crazy and way out there?
Because it's that person's personality? Yeah. So she's mentioning Slavoj Žižek, who's a famous philosopher of the present, who is a weirdo, like really a weirdo. And people put up with a lot of, I guess you could call it violation of social convention from him, that maybe they wouldn't in other people. You know? So
like celebrated in some way by kind of a fringe contingency.
Yeah.
Zizek being Zizek, but there are points where, and I mean, even in lectures I've been in with him, where he says something that is so shocking.
Yeah.
And it's sort of like lost in the just volume of the things that he does that are shocking.
Yeah, I guess you could say there's a similar tolerance accorded to an individual along those lines. And we could probably talk about comedians that we have who we give a similar pass, but if they were at our Thanksgiving, we might pop them in the nose or something, right? But I mean, this is one of many different philosophies as ways of life practiced in the ancient world, and some people did it. I don't think you have to be a megalomaniac and think that you're always right in order to do that. As a matter of fact, Diogenes sees, one of the other stories is he sees a kid drinking, just with his hands, and he's like, oh man, he's beat me in simplicity. I'm throwing away my bowl. So he's certainly willing to like take direction. But he's not for everybody, that's for sure. I mean, I wouldn't want to hang out with him, but some people thought, that's a good way to go. Here's another thing that happened. So Alexander the Great, this is a famous story, comes up to him, and this is in Corinth, and he stands over him and he says, ask me for anything that you'd like. You're a famous person. I'm, the biggest king around. And Diogenes is like, you're in my sun. Can you move out of my light? And it shows like he doesn't care about all of those sorts of things. Alexander, there's another case where he comes and he says, I'm Alexander the Great King. And Diogenes says, well, I'm Diogenes the Cynic. And he's asked, well, what did you do to be called a cynic? So cynic means hound, dog, kunes. It was also like a gymnasium, the kunosarges, right? So it's kind of a play on words. Why did they get called a dog? And he says, well, I fawn on those who give me anything. I yelp at those who refuse, and I set my teeth in rascals. So kind of a joking response. And then the other one is Alexander comes to him and says, aren't you afraid of me? And he says, well, I mean, are you a good thing or a bad thing? And Alexander says, well, I'm a good thing. And he says, well, who would be afraid of a good thing? I'm not going to be afraid of you unless you're going to do me some harm. So there's that. You may have also seen the image of him with the lantern in the day. That ring a bell? Now, he didn't say I'm looking for an honest man. The story is he's actually going around and he says, I'm looking for a man, or strictly speaking, human being, an anthropos. Somebody who is fully developed as a human being. And so, this is supposed to like show people that the life that they're living is not the one that they should be. I mentioned the thing about the marketplace. I think that's probably one of the most famous ones. He also endorsed, and he's not the only person to do this, cosmopolitanism. So cosmos is the world. Polites is citizen. He's asked where he's a citizen of, and he says, I'm a citizen of the world. There were a few other philosophers who said similar things in ancient times, and that will become later on an important part of Stoic doctrine, Stoic cosmopolitanism, the notion that we're all part of one vast city or a commonwealth that includes all of us human beings and the gods. But Diogenes is kind of doing that on his own. And then another issue that comes up, he's asked, so, we always like talking about ourselves, right? You go to a job interview, describe yourself in a couple sentences. So he's given the opportunity to describe himself, and he says, I'm a Socrates gone mad. There's other cases of that being attributed to other people. But he's placing, if this is a real quote, he's placing himself within this lineage, but he's saying, I do things different than Socrates did. He would go around and ask you a bunch of questions. I'm going to make examples out of things. And he, he's kind of a disagreeable guy. He really went after Plato. He would do things like Plato's trying to define human being. Any of you know this story? And he's, they say a feathered biped. So he plucks a chicken and he throws it into Plato's academy. And he says, there you go, there's a human being. And obviously he's trying to show Plato that he's got things wrong. But he also had bad stuff to say about other philosophers as well. He says that Euclides, his school sucks. He says that the performances at the Dionysia, so when the tragedies, the great tragedies are happening, he calls those peep shows for fools, And he says that the demagogues, the rulers who, get people on their side, are the mob's lackeys. They're basically the servants of the mob. So he's saying provocative stuff, right? So that's his character. There's a lot of other stories that could be told about the guy, but I think those kind of put it in perspective. His way of dying, and he died pretty old, is kind of representative of this. He's supposed to have been 90 years old when he died, so clearly he managed to do this for a long time. And some say that he was seized with a disease after eating an octopus raw. Now, why the hell would he do that? Well, so he apparently experimented with eating raw meat and stuff like that. The idea was we're going to get back to nature, Other animals don't have to cook their meat. Why can't we do that? Well, it turns out human beings pretty much do need to cook our meat, right? So he could have died for that reason. Another story is that he died voluntarily by holding his breath. I don't know about that. Yeah, I mean, maybe that's something. So in that account of the story, they show up, he's under his cloak, they shake him a bit, they're like, hey, wake up. They take the thing off, he's dead. And so they come up with that theory on the spot, right? But he could have it could have just been his body wore out. 90 years old, anything could go wrong, right? Another thing is that he got bit by a dog and he died of the wound. And this one involves an octopus as well. He's trying to divide an octopus among the dogs. He's going to share an octopus with them, and it doesn't go well, and one of the dogs bites him on his leg, and that's what he succumbs to. Again, we don't know. Nobody really. Somebody evidently must know back in that time, presumably Diogenes himself, but they're all gone. So it's kind of a funny feature, but that's okay. The humor part of it, I think, fits in well. Now, I mentioned that there is some controversy about the Cynic school and Diogenes. So the traditional account is that you've got Socrates, he's got all these students, Antisthenes is one of them. Diogenes comes in from Sinope, meets up with Antisthenes, bothers him until he'll, take him on as a student. Antisthenes teaches Diogenes a way of life. Antisthenes dies. Diogenes then takes on his own students, which include Crates, who becomes the next important Cynic, who, by the way, is a married Cynic. He winds up with Hipparchia, who decides that she not only wants to be a cynic, but she loves Crates. And so he's like, you don't want to live this kind of life, I'm basically a vagabond. She's like, that's exactly what I want. I don't want these suitors. I don't want the people my parents are setting me up with. I want to live the life of philosophy with you. And he's like, well, that's going to mean a lot of rough living and also, doing it in the road. And she's like, that sounds great, So those would be in Diogenes' lineage. And if you think of it this way, what's the benefit of putting it like that? Well, it came from Socrates, right? So Cynicism then is a legitimate Socratic philosophy. So then when Crates teaches Zeno, the first Stoic, the Stoics can say, see, we go all the way back to Socrates. I myself don't have any problem with buying that narrative, but there are a lot of people today who are like, no, I think the Cynic school, Antisthenes was doing some things, but I don't think he really was a cynic. I think the first cynic is Diogenes, which would make him, in effect, kind of what we call sui generis, of his own sort. Sort of like Epicurus. Epicurus was not in the Socratic lineages. So that would mean the Cynic school wouldn't be a Socratic school. And, why do some scholars doubt the traditional story? It's tough to get all the dates to line up the way they should, so maybe there's some merit to that. Since Crates is the teacher of Zeno, you could say, well, it's to their benefit to have this narrative. And, looking at the portrayals that we do have. So we've got Xenophon in his writings, particularly in the Symposium, we get Antisthenes described, right? And then much later we get Diogenes Laertes. So if they're right about what Antisthenes was like, he wasn't fully a cynic. He's a proto-cynic, but maybe not the way that Diogenes and Crates and the later guys are. So my own feeling about this is, I don't know. I'm happy to say that Antisthenes was a cynic and this lineage went on. But some people get really worked up about this. There's almost nothing in academia that people can't get very bitter and upset about. Yeah.
So, it seems to me we're dealing a lot with credibility. In other words,
In terms of the sources, you mean, or?
no, not historical sources.
Yeah.
The academies. Oh, I was in this academy. This was my teacher.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
the same way you get the lineage of racehorses.
Mm-hmm.
Who is this, and how far does it go back? I see the same thing. Oh, did Diogenes really write this? Well, if it's attributed to him,
Yeah.
King Solomon didn't write 3/4 of what is attributed to him in the Bible.
Yeah, although that's a very different textual issue. Most people think that the stuff that's in Diogenes Laertes, that's attributed to the different philosophers, and there's hundreds of them in there. They did write those books. We just don't have those books. Whether Solomon wrote the Wisdom of Solomon, which is a very, very late text, probably not, right? But there we actually have a text, whereas with these things.
But we don't know who the real writer was.
That's right. But when it comes to the things that are attributed to Diogenes, we have no reason to think that he didn't write those books and that somebody else wrote those books. And the lineage thing, some people cared about that, many others didn't, because you didn't get much out of having been the student of so-and-so. You had to prove yourself by what you brought to the table, or else you basically just became a footnote. And so here was a student of Plato who blah, 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 who we don't care about, like his nephew Speusippus, who took over the academy after him. We don't really care much about him. We care about the people who were in the school much later on who did something new and interesting and original of their own. And they didn't do it because they were in the lineage of Plato. They did it because they were afforded the opportunities that were there because of being part of an academy, I think if you tried to rely just on, hey, I'm descended from Zeno or Plato, they'd kind of laugh at you if you don't have anything cool and new to contribute, And then most of these lineages died out anyway. By the time of Plutarch, there really isn't anybody running the show anymore. But he's a Platonist. But he doesn't say, well, I descend from these guys who are Platonists or anything like that. The last scholarch of the Stoic school was Panaetius of Rhodes. But there were many Stoics after him, who make contributions of their own. With Diogenes, would he have cared about himself, whether he was descended from Antisthenes? It'd be out of character, wouldn't it? But that's just because he's a cynic. But it is, it is an interesting question. We know that he did seem to have other students. There's Crates, who's quite important. And there's a guy, Onesicritus, who came to Athens because his sons were attracted to Diogenes' teachings. Hegesias of Sinope is supposed to have been a student. We don't know much about him. This guy Monimus was the slave of a Corinthian money changer, and he seems to have done some stuff with Diogenes, but he went a more skeptical route, claiming that everything was tuphos or deception. That's not a particularly helpful way to go. And there was a legislator, Cercidas of Megapolis, who was apparently an admirer, whatever that means, of Diogenes, thought that Diogenes was on the right track. And after Diogenes, the Cynic school goes on for a while, but you notice it's not like a huge school like Plato's Academy or Aristotle's Lyceum with lots and lots of students. It's more like you get to study with these guys and then you figure out what you want to do with it. They get viewed by some ancient philosophers as just a bunch of dirty bums. Cicero says, "Yeah, you don't want to be like these cynics. That's not a good way to live." They're going too far. And then, interestingly, in the Christian era, there are a few authors who take up positive attitudes towards Cynicism, and they could be seen as kind of connected to the Cynics. Epictetus, I mentioned, the Stoic philosopher, he's got an entire chapter on the Cynic way of life, which might be kind of idealized, but he calls it the royal road to virtue. But he's like saying, take the good stuff from the Cynics, don't take the bad stuff from them, right? And that emperor who I mentioned, Julian the emperor, he's actually got a discourse to the uneducated Cynics, because apparently there were a bunch of guys in his time who were wandering around and saying, "Hey, man, I'm a Cynic. Give me some food. I'm gonna tell you everything that's wrong about you." And so they were putting on an act, right? And he's like, "That's not the way that a Cynic should actually behave. You should look at what these other people did back in the day. You should be cultivating your virtue and developing some discipline, not just eating and drinking and doing whatever the hell you want to, right?" So there were clearly different points of view on this school. There were some people who took it up and practiced it. It's kind of an experiment. And then later on, why do we have this word cynic that is very different? In the Renaissance and onward, it comes to designate somebody who's critical of the status quo and current values and stuff like that, but doesn't have any of the positive stuff that the ancient Cynics had. They're just trying to tear things down. So when we say somebody's cynical today, we don't mean the ancient Cynics. We mean this sense of everybody's on the make, everybody's got their own agenda, that sort of thing, and they look on people's motives badly. But that's a different sense of the term, right? Yeah, you had your hand up. Yeah.
Because I don't suppose time. Broad question.
Sure.
Why did you invest your time studying him?
Oh, Diogenes?
Yes. And what is the one thing you would like us to take away?
Okay. I mean, I think there's two answers to the first one. So I'm interested in the broad history of philosophy and knowing where these people fit and studying that sort of stuff without necessarily endorsing them or drawing on them, right? So there's kind of a scholarly answer, which is that, the Cynics are an interesting school in ancient philosophy, and they feed into the Stoics, so it's good to know.
But him,
Well, he's an important Cynic. So to know about the Cynics, you got to know about
you have this big
Diogenes.
smile on your face the whole time.
Well, I think he's
I
he's a funny guy. I mean, and I also like doing what I do, which is talking about philosophy. I think that, when I was younger, there was more of an attraction to that kind of free ourselves from all this BS, man, kind of looking down on people who were, the squares who just buy into all the societal values. Yeah, I think a lot of us go through phases like that when we're in our teens and 20s, but most of us manage to leave that behind at some point, right? And become productive members of society. But I do kind of like the humor that's involved with him. And now the one takeaway. I would say the biggest takeaway is that when people talk about cynicism today, it doesn't mean the same thing as what these guys were doing. They were committed to a way of life, and it was kind of an experiment. They would commit themselves to living without a fixed abode, begging, practicing the virtues, being despised by a lot of people, because they were hoping that would lead them to happiness. And they do seem to have been happy in a certain way, right? Diogenes was content with his life. Crates was content with his life. So that's different than the sneering cynic that, anything happens and they're like, oh, I know. They don't really mean
Think of
it.
someone in today that you would ascribe to that old school.
The old school?
Yeah, someone you would say is lives by that.
Boy, that's a good question. And lives in this sort of homeless ascetic way. I mean, nobody comes to mind for me.
Would Mahatma Gandhi be considered a cynic?
No, because he's definitely committed to all sorts of ideas coming from Indian philosophy. He is an ascetic, and that he shares in common with the Cynics, but he has a very different orientation towards what he wants to do. And the Cynics were not nonviolent by any means. If they needed to defend themselves, they had no problem doing that. It's part of why they had the staff. Yeah, nobody really comes to mind easily like that. I mean, we do have people who are frank speakers, like we could think of certain comedians. If I had to pick a comedian of the present day who is kind of like Diogenes that way, it would be Bill Burr. Because he is very down to earth and respects nobody's sort of political correctness, whether on the right or the left. And he says stuff that's often kind of, I think he's better now that he's older. I think he's learned some things. And when he says things, you're like, yeah, actually, he's probably right about that, He is saying things. And he's always one step away from being canceled, either by the right or the left, Right now, the people on the right are mad at him because they thought he was one of them, and then he was like, "No, I'm not with you people. Here's where I think you've got all sorts of stuff wrong." So I don't know, maybe, but he has a house, he has a wife, so yeah, he's got plenty of money in the bank, So I don't know that he'd describe himself as a cynic. And if you imagine we could bring him in here, and we're like, okay, so you heard about this Diogenes guy, Bill? We think that you're the closest thing to him. He'd be, that's bullshit. What are you talking about? He'd be kind of self-deprecating, I think, about that. So
I would vote for the late George Carlin.
oh yeah, okay.
I remember
Yeah.
one routine he talked about, everybody buys a house, and then they fill it with stuff.
Yeah.
And then they get more stuff, so they have to buy a bigger house. And then they get more stuff, so they have to buy an even bigger house, you know, just gotta.
Well, we have that solved now. You know, we have storage lockers.
Oh, there we go, yeah.
Yeah, actually, that George Carlin could work. Again, somebody who, so the frankness of speech, right?
Yeah.
George Carlin, I think a lot of people thought of him as being on the left, but he was fine with like skewering people on the left whenever they did something kind of goofy too, you know? Lenny Bruce?
Yeah.
Yeah,
I mean,
he could.
Carlin owes a lot to Lenny Bruce. A lot of people.
That's true, yeah.
He was oftentimes viewed as a comic and a satirist, but he was more a social
Commentator.
commentator. Yeah.
Who do we have in the present?
Well, and does it have to be a comedian?
No, not necessarily.
Well,
What's
I
that?
was trying to think of inventors and innovators, people that, you know, they just want to new, I don't know. I just
Well,
tried to think, you know,
They require significant like
discipline.
capital outlay and stuff like that, you know. Well, so that's the thing. So like with Gandhi's not a cynic, but he does have discipline, right? Very disciplined about what he did. So it's not just having the discipline. I think you got to have the frank speaking, the breaking social conventions, the being willing to be homeless.
Really, Bourdain was like that. I mean, the whole
Oh,
thing
yeah.
with culinary was-
So Anthony Bourdain,
He followed a girl to the bathroom and he scored her on campus. I mean, he was just, dude, so awesome. Every time, I used to work at Culinary Institute of America, and every time he would come to visit, like, the cult following around him was more than just getting confidential. It was this idea that he'd go into the wilds and eat boar rectum and, like, do all of these things.
yeah, and then write about it.
Yeah, and suffered from it, and suffered from what he saw
Yeah.
and the ways of the world and that kind of thing. So there's like chefs, there's comedians, because they're given this creative space. It doesn't have to be a comedian, but somebody who's creating things.
Yeah, I guess.
Consumption.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, the chef creates something we're supposed to be destroying and consuming it, right? Like that's the big thing. And so when they create these beautiful things, our
Okay.
job is to tear it apart. And I think comedians, whether it's Bill Burr or Lenny Bruce or George Carlin or even Dave Chappelle, right, constantly being canceled, constantly saying their own thing and constantly doubling down on it.
Yeah,
It's the idea of saying, I'm calling out your hypocrisy, or I'm calling out your gluttony, or I'm calling out your whatever it is. And I don't know that Diogenes did that in his little wine barrel, but there's like kind of a nice blend between like Tolkien's hobbits and, you know, this other, like you've got to leave the
You know-
fire to beat the beast.
that makes me think of something. So one of the things that doesn't come across in literary works that like with comedians or somebody like, imagine Anthony Bourdain on a talk show or something like that, is timing, right? Something, if you say it the right way, it's suddenly funny or illuminating or something like that. But it's got to be with the right timing. We don't have, all we have is like, so-and-so was saying this, and then Diogenes said this. You know, or Diogenes went in this guy's house and he did this sort of thing. We don't know what the tempo or the timing was like. He might have been extraordinarily funny to the people around him, you know.
If you want to talk about a social critic,
Yeah.
Charles Chaplin.
Oh, yeah, yeah,
I'm not saying his life, but I think his films.
yeah. Talk about a sense of timing, too.
Industry,
Yep,
government, society, you know.
yeah.
Yeah.
Dating, fascism, yeah, he like
The
covered,
Great Dictator.
yeah.
That movie.
Yeah, I mean, and would Chaplin have been cool with just kind of like wandering around doing that stuff? Like, here's a question you could say: if you weren't getting paid well to do this social questioning activity, would you still keep doing it? And maybe Chaplin would have, you know, and maybe Bill Burr would if nobody paid him to come and give funny talks or stuff like that. And Bourdain, you know, certainly he was willing to be a vagabond, right? So
Yeah, I mean, I think that would have been his preferred existence, and sort of like the trappings of fame are what drove him crazy.
yeah, that's true.
Speaking of crazy.
Yeah.
Do you think this Diogenes had a mental condition, bipolar, manic depressive?
I mean, I'm very leery about taking the very thin historical data that we have and trying to superimpose recent, whether they're psychoanalytic or psychotherapeutic categories onto them. I just don't think that we don't have. I think we don't have enough to do that sort of thing. I mean, I'm even leery about people diagnosing political figures at a distance. Unless you actually have them in your office, it's always kind of sketchy to do that, right? So now that said, you can always like go into the DSM and say, okay, well, here's the characteristics of this. If we look through all these texts, maybe Diogenes hit 4 of the 10 for bipolar disorder or something like that. But it's super speculative.
You speculate about all the other stuff. I mean, you don't know if it's his writings or whatever. And I respect the fact you don't want to diagnose someone.
Yeah.
But it just trying to.
I mean, therapists get that stuff
Yeah.
wrong,
Yeah.
even when they have the client or patient right in front of them some of the time. So, yeah, I don't know.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I'll put it to you this way. He was considered by some people to be nuts, right? I
You
mean,
said it yourself, crazy.
yeah. Although I wasn't using it like the mentally ill way, just like, wow, that's really out there kind of stuff. But I mean, some of the people some of the people thought Socrates was mad, that he had the wrong priorities in life and stuff like that. We see that in some of the Platonic dialogues where they're like, what's wrong with you? Philosophy, that's fine for young guys. You're 70 years old, you shouldn't be screwing around with this kind of stuff. Get a real job, buddy, that sort of thing. What were you going to say?
I was going to ask, were the ancient Cynics anti-government? Were
anti the people in charge of the government at almost any time, you could say. But I mean, they did think that you could have good people in charge. It's just really rare that actually turns out to be the case. So, and being in charge kind of like puts you in their crosshair.
So would they be against the structure?
Just per se, I
no
don't
structure?
I don't think so. I mean, again, it would be fascinating if we had Diogenes' book, The Republic, because that presumably was where he would have communicated his political theory, but we don't have it. Yeah.
Where does the Cynic fit in with something like Aesop's fables that are also talking about how to improve society, how to improve human behavior, that sort of thing?
I mean, Aesop's fables are all allegories, right? They have that like little moral at the end, and a lot of them are like about personal improvement. So you could view Aesop's fables as a popular means for promoting certain ways of living and choices to make and priorities and stuff like that.
Isn't that exactly what the Cynics were doing? Ways of living, priorities?
Well, insofar as you're talking about that, but that doesn't mean that the Cynics and Aesop were doing the same thing because they have different content. You don't see Aesop saying, yeah, man, go live in a barrel. That would be a great way to live. Spit on people's floors. It's much more prosaic stuff like,
Jesus was doing it more impolitely.
Well, I don't think we have to try to assimilate these things to each other like that. I think it's fine just to let the Cynics be the Cynics and be a philosophical school of life that is very different than most of the other schools, and that's fine. Yeah.
Yeah, it seems like the Cynics were very much kind of a niche philosophy for just a few people to go out and live.
Yeah.
Did they have, or any of the school, you say that all Diogenes' works are lost.
Yeah.
And we don't have books of any of the later Cynics as well.
Oh, so
wider.
Yeah, I mean, what we
Republic is lost.
Yeah.
Idea of how to live in society, or to have a married life. Or,
what we do have.
And none of the Cynics, the way you describe it, none of the Cynics could have, well, except for the one lady.
Crates and Hipparchia. Yeah.
Well, I guess why to live.
Yeah. And they had children.
Right. None of them, could have kids and go out and raise food for.
We do have later writings, right, by people who had some allegiance to the Cynic school as they understood it at their time, but this is like centuries later. So Lucian of Samosata appears to have been attracted to Cynicism himself, and he's got a book called Demonox, which is about a philosopher named Demonox who's a Cynic, and apparently he's a really great guy, loved by his city and stuff like that. But that's the only source that we have for this philosopher. Seneca, who's a Stoic, talks about a Cynic called Demetrius, who he tells us a bit about. So there were people practicing it, centuries later. And there are
Did they have any philosophy of your family or state?
What's that?
Did they have any, the later Cynics, wanted themselves beyond just, this
Yeah, I mean they are.
lifestyle to have any kind of.
Well, the whole point of like doing it wasn't just to like be an individual on your own. It was supposed to be beneficial for your city, your society, by providing them with an example and speaking the truth to them. And that's true.
You
Yeah,
can't grow food,
yeah, you're dependent on other people.
You're dependent on other people.
Yeah, but so is almost everybody in a society with division of labor. If you're a shoemaker, you don't grow your own food. You get your food from somebody else who buys your shoes. So I think they thought of themselves as having like a social function. Now, did they ever?
They can't tell the shoemaker how to be a cynic.
The Cynic?
He has to make the shoes.
Yeah.
He can't go around homeless.
Did they want him to stop making the shoes and be a cynic?
Yeah.
Does the Cynic want him to do that?
Yeah.
Nobody says that they should. But I mean, there are some things that you can do as an iterate practitioner. Think about tinkers. Paul, was a tent maker, and he wanders all over the place. So there's trades you could ply. As far as like the literature of the newer Cynics, do they have any like really well developed political doctrines? None that come to mind for me. Because what we're talking about there is Julian, Lucian, the little bits of stuff we get from Seneca, Diochrysostom, and then we have these Cynic letters, right? But the Cynic letters, we don't know who the hell wrote them. They're attributed to Anacharsis, who is a Scythian.
Well, someone wrote them. So.
Yeah, and they're reflective of. It's sort of like we have like works of Aristotle that weren't really by Aristotle, right? Somebody in his school wrote it, but we're like, yeah, it's in the current of Aristotle, but I don't recall having seen much political doctrine in those Cynic epistles either. It's mostly like ethical, but there's a lot of stuff about family life, because some of those letters are Crates and Hipparchia writing to each other. Again, not in reality, but imagining like what would it be like if these two had written to each other, So yeah, go ahead.
Did Diogenes have any contact with Pericles, the leader of Athens, the quote, democratic leader of Athens, Pericles?
Oh, Pericles. I thought you said Heracles at first.
Pericles.
No, that Pericles was even before Socrates. Socrates was a young man when he may have studied with Pericles' mistress, who had a salon, Aspasia, who may be the Diodema of Plato's Symposium, the wise woman who taught Socrates everything he knows about love. So that would be an even older generation, and then Socrates would be like the next generation, then Plato, and then Diogenes. So really 3 or 4 generations removed from each other. Yeah. But I guess you could say, Pericles left a stamp on Athens, so just like, not this area so much, but like when you get down into Milwaukee, and then go out, a little bit further west, the Lapems, that Lapem Peak is named after, right? You go into the big library, and it turns out that they had some role, apparently, in promoting early on stuff that had to do with our beautiful library. I mean, you could say Pericles had a much bigger stamp on Athens, but he was long dead, by the time Diogenes shows up. And Diogenes is an out-of-towner too, He's not a citizen of Athens. He's a citizen of a place that kicked him and his dad out, apparently, for debasing the coinage. Yeah.
I mean, is it fair to say that the ancient Cynicism movement, it kind of died out?
Yeah.
Do you agree? And would you say would you attribute that to the lifestyle not being that desirable? And so the lifestyle kind of makes the movement die out, but then the ideas, and shall we say the better parts of the ideas now, live on, and that's what we're talking about it now. Is that fair?
Well, most of the ancient schools die out.
It's not just.
Yeah, and they die out in part because they're assimilated or replaced by Christianity. And the Cynics were attracted to certain kinds of Christians who do write about them. And then so there were kind of what would we call it, like revivals in the Renaissance of certain philosophical approaches, Platonism, Epicureanism, which even drew in like a Catholic priest, Pierre Gassendi was an Epicurean, Stoicism, but it doesn't look like Cynicism in the ancient sense really drew a lot of attention or followers. There is a community online today of people who claim that they're practicing Cynicism, There's like a Facebook group called the Kunosarges. I haven't looked at it for years, so I don't know how legit these people are. But it does bear some similarities with a movement that people call minimalism. That was kind of a big thing 10 years ago. And you could look at that as kind of like, I don't know, I guess a cynicism purified of any reference to the gods and more oriented towards just living a simple life, right? But it doesn't, the minimalists don't have a lot of like, hey man, I'm going to stick it to society and, tell them what I think and,
It's still an aesthetic movement about
Yeah.
having a really nicely ordered space. It's still very materialistic. Minimalism itself isn't necessarily about
Well,
being yourself of your possessions or belongings. It's like freeganism.
some of them are like, digital nomads and stuff. And they have a couple
really
manifestos.
digital thing.
Yeah.
Like you're not traveling in rags and tatters.
That's true, yeah.
A really expensive camera and a great backpack and very well-made Merrill hiking boots. This isn't.
Yeah, I guess so.
Yeah, but the freeganism sort of fringe of that, where
Okay.
you sell all your belongings, you eat out of dumpsters,
Yeah, that would be like the Cynics.
Yeah.
What about the St. Francis?
Oh,
Friar?
yeah. I mean, practicing voluntary poverty. Yeah, I mean, I don't think they're inspired at all by the Cynics. I think it's following the example Francis takes to be set by Christ. But I guess you could see some parallels there. And the Franciscans did plenty of like telling truth to power over the course of their lifetime. So yeah, that could work. Orders where that wouldn't happen, the Benedictines. Stability and staying in one place is very, very important for them. The Dominicans were a little bit too obsessed with fighting heresy, Maybe they wouldn't fit in that spectrum very well. So I think, we can find parallels, but there aren't any there isn't any Cynic school in the present, We do have plenty of modern cynicism, people being cynical about things, but yeah. Well, they're probably going to kick us out before too long and start ringing the bell. So thanks very much for all of your questions. And so next time we'll look at Mary Wollstonecraft. Very interesting author from the 18th century.